So good morning, everyone. I don't know what time zone you're in. I'm in the central time zone, but it's still morning here. So thank you for the introduction, Madison, and thank you all for taking the time out of your busy day to spend a little time with me. As you heard from my bio, most of my background is in jobs and pay and jobs. So it sort of goes back and forth between those two topics. So I'm happy to be here today to share some of that information and some recent developments in the work that I've been doing in adapting systems to include traditional knowledge. Just to get started, I'll click over to my slides here. Okay. So I hope that's showing up to everyone. Okay, so I'll try to run through these fairly quickly and save as much time as I can for questions at the end. So really, this all started with some work I was doing with various Indigenous organizations over the last, I'd say, 5 years. And people have been saying, this is all great. We know now we have a job evaluation system, but we have jobs that require traditional knowledge or cultural knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, however you want to term it. And for example, we want to hire somebody who has really strong knowledge of land-based practices because we want to run a course and we want to teach younger people how to identify different plants that they might use for medicinal reasons and whatever, lots of things that people want to do in their organizations. And they look at those jobs and they say, well, we don't need to have somebody with a university degree to do this job. We need somebody who has actually been there, who has the practical skills, who has the experience, and who has a background with Indigenous people and their culture and their spiritual interests and all of those things. That's what we need. And so how do we can advertise that job for those with those qualifications, but how do we fairly evaluate it in relation to jobs that have really highly established formal education, like a college degree or a university degree, that sort of thing? How do we balance those things and be fair in how we pay those the people in those jobs? So that's the one question that kept coming up. And the other one was, so once we hire people who have that background, how do we make sure that we retain them and keep them? And how do we make sure that we identify that their qualifications are different than those of conventional organizations, but they are valued, and we want to make sure that they understand that, and that we encourage our employees to develop those skills and knowledge as well. So that's kind of how we got to this presentation today. Those are the kinds of questions I was getting. And so I started working with a couple of different organizations that wanted to actually do something about it. Aside from just asking the questions, they wanted to know, what can we do? So the topics that we've got set up for today, this first topic is really about that work in trying to find ways to incorporate valuing traditional knowledge in the case of jobs and in the case of people. And that just feeds nicely into the second topic, which is, for those of you who work in HR, will be kind of a refresher on salary systems and how they relate to job values and to people's qualifications. And then the third topic is really going to focus a little bit on pay equity, and because that's one of the areas I specialize in. But also, I think many organizations have not got a good handle on pay equity, and it's something that you should know about and be aware of and think about how you're going to move forward in that direction. So just to summarize again, those challenges that we have. So it's the struggle of trying to say, okay, how can we be equitable in valuing traditional knowledge when all of our systems are really focused on conventional value? And so just in terms of what I think of as a conventional knowledge scale, this is what most job evaluation tools look like in terms of job knowledge or education, however they term it. But a lot of them have this kind of a scale, and so it's very well established and accepted in conventional circles. But as you can see when you look at it, so where would you fit in land-based knowledge in there? Where would you fit in knowledge of medicines? Where would you fit in being able to work well with community members because you understand them, you can speak their language? Where is it in there? It's not there. It's just not there. And so I fully understand the significance of trying to relate that information somehow to the value of the job. But this scale doesn't do it. So what we did was we said, okay, what about if we take the traditional scale, a knowledge scale, and we add it to that conventional scale and say it's equivalent? So that was our starting point for the work that I've done with a couple of organizations now. And we were revising their job evaluation tools in any case. And so this was a good chance to update them and bring traditional knowledge into the picture. So GIS was one of the clients that I've worked with, and they were helpful in allowing me to share this information with you. I don't have the full scale in the slides. There are 7 different levels, but I wanted to use it as a sample so you could get an idea of what we did. So our starting point with all of this, although what you're looking at is kind of the end result, we started by trying to define cultural knowledge in their organization. And I would think that any Indigenous organization that wants to try this approach needs to start there, because I don't know that there's just one definition for traditional or cultural or Indigenous knowledge. I think there are different definitions and they have to fit the nature of the organization. So that's your starting point always. I've included an URL in my slides at the very end, just to give you a sample of one definition, but there are many. And one of the hardest parts was making that definition up in the first place and coming to something that everybody could agree on. So that was our starting point. Once we had that, then we looked at developing the scale. So this degree 1, degree 2 is kind of standardized in job evaluation, and the institution-based education, those pieces were already there in their job evaluation tool. They already had that kind of a scale. So what we did was we said, okay, where would these pieces of knowledge and skill from an Indigenous perspective, where would they fit against that scale? So, and that took some working around, because they wanted to make sure that one of the things that they wanted to value was the medicinal side, because they're a health service. So they were looking at medicine, and they were looking also at being able to relate to community members and understand the things that they've gone through. People who are residential school survivors, for example, people who have suffered crisis within their community, those kinds of things. There were a broad range of things they wanted to make sure they could value. So we worked on this for quite a while before we came up with the current scale. And you might look at it and go, well, that wouldn't work for our organization, and that's fine. Maybe it won't, but I wanted to give you an idea of what you might look at doing. I'm sure there are other ways of coming at this, but this seemed to be a good starting point. We already had a scale in place. It was a matter of matching it up with what we thought of as traditional knowledge or skills. So if you look at the slides, you'll see that it scales up. So just as the traditional the conventional scale scales up from high school to college to university to master's degrees, that sort of thing, we've scaled up the cultural knowledge piece accordingly. And so one thing that you need to think about if you're going to take this approach is, if you're going to use terms like sound knowledge or working knowledge, those kinds of things, you have to define those too in order to be consistent in applying the scale when you're rating jobs. So you'll see that the ability to speak, read, or write, Anishinaabe is scales up as well as we go up the scale. So at the very top end, we're looking at the ability to translate as well. And so the scale of the depth of the skill expands as we go up the scale. So that'll give you a little slice of what we did there, and some idea perhaps of how that might work for you. So our second question was, what do we do about trying to recognize and value traditional knowledge in the employees who and look at what they bring to the job and to our organization. So I've got a couple of organizations I've worked with on this question as well. When we're still working on one of them. But what I've got for you in terms of an example is a scale that we developed at 7 Generations. So just to go back to the conventional approach, it's really common in many occupations to have a tiered approach to pay that fits with qualifications. So, and those of you who work for school boards will have seen secondary teachers, it's A1, A2, A3, A4. So that's a tiered approach to pay. As you get more specialty courses that you can teach and greater skills, the scale, the pay scale goes up. Similarly, with social workers, if you have an MSW, you start at a higher rate of pay than someone who has a DSW. So DSW is kind of basic, and then it goes up to BSW and MSW. So those kinds of scales have been around in conventional organizations for I don't know how many decades before my time even. That goes back a long way. So we said, why don't we take that approach and try to see how we can utilize it in the circumstances that 7 Generations had. So what they were looking to do was to look at how they pay their instructors. Historically, they had paid them. If you're an instructor, you're an instructor. They hadn't differentiated between the nature of the skills and knowledge that the instructor brought to the course. They tried to look at how much experience they had from the perspective of, had they taught a lot before? Had they taught a lot of courses? And so maybe you can, look at it from an experience perspective and say, okay, here's somebody who's taught 10 courses for us. So we know them well. We know that we know the quality of their teaching skills, and we can assess that and maybe pay them more money. But they wanted to look at differentiating from the very start. And they wanted very much to make sure that those instructors that were teaching their traditional courses would get rewarded, if you will, financially for that knowledge that they bring to their job as an instructor. So this is it's a 3-level scale. And it applies to formal education, but it also applies to traditional knowledge. And the traditional knowledge pieces come from their job evaluation tool. So we first worked on the job evaluation tool to look at the value of the job. And then we looked at how we could bring that into the instructor's scale to ensure that people who bring those skills to their instructional work get rewarded for that level of knowledge. So we're going to come back and talk a bit about how this fits into the pay piece later, or shortly. But I wanted you to see what they've done. So this, we formulated this by sort of shrinking the formal knowledge piece, and then adapting the traditional knowledge from the job evaluation tool that they have. So we go from 2 to 3 years of formal study to 4 years. And then again, a higher degree of traditional knowledge. And they are very, very focused on speaking and reading and writing in Indigenous dialects, because they're an education institute. It's part of what they do. They really, really want to encourage their students to learn the language, because it's getting lost. And they're also concerned about how many first language speakers they're able to bring in as instructors, and they want to make sure they reward them for the knowledge that they bring to their work. So it scales up this way. and then it scales up on the traditional knowledge side. So it's possible with either of these approaches to rate jobs, whether the requirements are formal, conventional sort of things, or whether they're traditional, and reward both. Again, to use this, you really need to have a good handle on what traditional knowledge is in your organization and be really clear about it. That's not hard to do. It's just hard to get consensus sometimes to get everybody on the same page in terms of what they believe is fair. So that's the work that I've been involved in so far on trying to incorporate traditional knowledge, and I hope you'll find that helpful. So now I want to turn to how we can take those job evaluation results and the qualifications and turn them into different reward systems in your pay system. So when we talk about recognizing job value, there are really three pieces to this. The first is pay bands, which is a way of grouping jobs and differentiating between jobs. And you need some sort of criteria. So generally, from a job evaluation tool, if it's a point-based plan, then you'll have job points. So you'll have jobs that are worth 200 points, jobs that are worth 350 points, jobs that are worth 175 points, whatever. And you can group them into bands by using a criteria that's the bottom end of the band and the top end of the band. So a band might be 100 points to 200 points, and the next one would be 201 points to 300 points, and so on. And bands are skinnier or wider depending on what the organization requires. And the second piece is pay ranges and some sort of criteria for progressing people through the range. So the standard pieces are either service, so every year people look at moving up in the pay range, or performance, which requires, of course, that you assess how people are performing and whether they're meeting expectations and standards in the job, and then differentiate on pay based on their performance. So those are the two standard approaches. But the most important piece, I think, in all of this is that all the jobs that are of similar value offer the same pay range. So if a job has 202 points and another job has 205 points, they should likely be in the same pay range. They shouldn't be paid differently on such a small difference in value. And every employee who falls into a pay range has to be paid within that range. So you can't pay someone less than the minimum, and you shouldn't pay them more than the maximum. And that sounds constricting to many people in many organizations, because especially managers who want to just say, oh, I've got this really great employee and I really want to pay them a whole bunch more money than I'm paying these other employees. I'm sure you've heard that from people. Certainly I did in the years I was practicing in HR before I started consulting. The problem with that is, or one of the problems is, that sometimes you end up overpaying people because at the moment that the manager is thinking about that person, the person just done something really great in the job and they think, oh, we got to pay them more money. Or the person has come to them and said, I'm going to leave if you don't pay me more money, which is kind of getting like blackmailed. But the thing is, you have to think about the other people who work in the organization, either people who work in the same job or people who work in related jobs, and how that might affect their motivation to stay with the organization and to continue to be motivated to do their job well. So we get into all kinds of problems when we don't have some sort of parameters on our pay. And that doesn't mean you can't be flexible to some extent, but you sure need to be consistent in how you apply it. And when you make a decision to go outside the range, there has to be a really good reason for doing that. So this next slide shows you kind of a basic pay system. And again, I'm sure that this isn't new to most of you. You probably have something like this in place. But I want to point out a couple of important pieces to this. The thing is, if you look at this scale, so we have a manager of services and we have a manager of administration. The points are a little bit different in the two jobs. One has 10 more points than the other, but because of pay bands, and in this case, the banding is from 500 points to 549, the two jobs end up in the same salary range. So you might have a difference in pay because F. Morneau has been there longer and has moved up in the scale. and B More So just started last week, so they might be closer to the bottom of the salary range. Or one of them might have a great deal of experience coming into the job, and so their starting salary might have been set higher in the range. But for sure, both salaries would be between 60,000 and 80,000. And the same with the frontline workers and the accounting payroll. The jobs have a slight difference in points, but they fall within the same band. And so everyone who is in that band gets paid between 35,000 and 40,000. Does that make sense? Nod your head if it makes sense. Okay, great. Thank you. So that's a basic scale. So then the next piece that I want to talk about is how we recognize employee qualifications. So we talked about tiered scales like A1, A2, A3, A4. And so what you're leading into there is what's called broad banding. Broad banding is a way of taking several pay ranges or pay bands and bringing them together. So I've got a slide just to show you what that might look like. So you might start off with 3 pay bands or 5 pay bands. The number of pay bands that get collapsed into a broadband varies depending on the organization. Most of my work, we've had maybe 4 bands that we've collapsed into a broadband. Sometimes it's as low as 2. I wouldn't go much wider than that because that's getting pretty scary in terms of bringing all the wages into the same pay range. But anyway, that's the difference. Is that the and now I got to go backwards. Shoot. Okay. Darn. Okay. So then let me see if I can go backwards. Previous. Okay. I'm going to pat myself on the back for being able to figure that out. Okay. So our pay ranges that recognize employee qualifications that are broadbands could look something like this. So if we took the same scale we just looked at, the simple scale, and turned it into a broadband, this is maybe what we come up with. So you can see that we have our manager of services and our manager of admin, and it's the same 2 employees that are in those jobs, but More So has a diploma and Morneau has a bachelor's degree. So if we were to hire both of them today, we would probably start More So at 60,000, maybe a little bit higher, depending again on their experience. And Morneau would start at 65. So Morneau would get a faster start in pay, a leapfrog, if you will, because they have a higher level of conventional knowledge. And if we had a scale that had traditional knowledge equivalencies, the same would happen. So we would use the same approach. And so you can see that the salary range gets quite broad when you broadband. In some organizations, a More So, for example, would get to the top of that pay range for a diploma, and they wouldn't go any higher unless the whole pay range moved. In other organizations, what they say is, to be perfectly fair, if somebody started at 60,000 with a diploma, but they stay with us for 15 years, they shouldn't get stuck at the top of the pay range for that tier. They should be able to move up to the next tier, because we have to recognize that although they don't have a bachelor degree, they have so much experience in their field that we should continue to recognize that. And eventually they'd be able to get to the very top salary, but it's a much wider salary than that first tier is. So, and I personally support that approach. I don't think it's fair to say to somebody, you don't have a higher degree, so you can't go any higher. However, I do have clients that use that approach, but they use it because they support their employees to go back to school. And they want them, for example, to take a bachelor's degree or a college diploma. And so they support them financially to do that. And when they get that degree or diploma, they move them up to the next tier automatically. So the employee gets rewarded financially for advancing their knowledge level. And so you could think about working that into your picture as well, depending on what you want to motivate people to do. If you want to motivate people to stay, then having them, be able to work their way up through the tiers and stay for 15 years would be a good thing. If you want to encourage them to increase their educational qualifications or their traditional knowledge, you might want to work it differently and just say, okay, if you don't change your skill level, you can't go up a level in terms of the pay scale. And you'll see I've worked in here just as an example that for our frontline grouping, same people, but we have a senior, intermediate, and junior. So we're not saying that the education level changes, but we're recognizing that the experience and expertise in the job changes over time as people work in the same job for a long period of time. And so again, in this case, I would say you'd want them to be able to move up through all the tiers over time. So you'd start them as a junior if they didn't have much experience coming in. If they came in with already having worked 5 years in the job, then maybe they'd start as an intermediate or a senior, depending on what your criteria is in your organization. But for sure, you want to set some criteria for how people get into those tiers so that it's consistent. So you don't end up with people who really don't have the qualifications who are at the top end of the scale and people who have qualifications in their bottom. And then you get all kinds of disgruntled employees in your organization. So I want to move along and talk about equity just for a few minutes. I just put this slide together because there are so many different terms out there on equity, and I talk to people who get so confused about what's what. And no darn wonder, because we use the word equity everywhere, and it's in all kinds of government legislation. It's also in lots of terminology within the human resources field. So internal equity usually looks at how do we pay people inside our organization relative to other jobs and people inside our organization? That's internal equity. Pay parity is if we have a job as an accountant in our organization, and there's another organization out there that's pretty well the same as us, it's in the same sector, and they pay their accountant differently, our accountant should get paid the same as that one. It's looking specifically at particular jobs and making cross references to those jobs. So it's very specific. Whereas external equity is looking at a variety of organizations, some of which may be in different sectors than yours. They might just be local. So they're peer organizations in that they're digging in the same basket for labor as you are. Like they're looking for people out of the same region or area. And there may be some organizations in that grouping that also are in the same sector as you, but not necessarily the case. And so it's taking all that data, putting it together for particular benchmark jobs where you can be pretty sure they're similar, but they're not the same. Pay parity is pretty well the same. External equity is pretty similar. Pay equity is a term in law in Ontario and federally now as well. And so I want to come back and talk more about that. Employment equity is treating people the same regardless of their color, race, background, culture, those kinds of things. That's what employment equity is about. So we have employment equity at the federal level in Canada. We don't have anything at the provincial level. And equal pay is legislated in pretty well every province and federally. Equal pay is about, I'm an electrician, you're an electrician, that guy over there is an electrician. We all have to be paid in the same pay range or at the same rate of pay. You can't say you're a female electrician, so I'll pay you less than I will a male electrician, for example. Or there's a female electrician over there and here's one over here, but I'm paying this one less because her eye color's wrong, whatever it is. But you can't pay people differently when they have the same occupational qualifications. So equity everywhere. So let's talk about pay equity though, because that's really what I want to be about today. So pay equity has, as I say, it's a term in law, but it's also about several important aspects of your pay system. So there are really three pillars: efficiency, fairness, and compliance. So I want to talk a little bit about each of those. So efficiency is about balance, really, because you want to pay enough if you can, what you can afford to pay, because we can't always afford to pay what we'd like to pay people, but to the extent that you can afford it, it's paying enough to try to attract and retain people in critical roles in your organization. But also, we all have limits to how much we can pay. Most of us do anyway. I don't know anybody who has unlimited funds to pay people. So we want to look at our operating costs and keep those in line. So it's like a teeter-totter. On the one hand, you want to pay more and raise this end up because you want to attract and retain really good people. But on the other end, you can't dip into too much of your operating costs on payroll, because then you end up with not enough funding. So it's always a teeter-totter. It's always going back and forth. And so efficiency is about seeking balance between not paying too much and paying enough. And so that's why we look at external equity. And the law in Ontario says you don't look at external equity, but really it's an important piece in your pay system, because you have to know what other people are paying and you have to think about it and relate to it. But pay equity only looks at external equity from the perspective of what's called proxy comparisons. And so some of your organizations would be eligible for proxy, or you may have done proxy comparisons already. So a proxy comparison happens when most of the jobs or all of the jobs in your organization are predominantly female. That doesn't mean everybody that works there is female, but it means that the nature of the work has historically and systemically been female. So jobs like nursing, although we have males working as nurses now, those jobs are still considered to be female because historically nurses have been female. Your receptionist job would be pretty well female, even though I see lots of organizations with males working in reception now, but times are changing. But historically, they've been female jobs. Truck drivers, again, we have women working as truck drivers and have for decades, but historically it was very much a male-dominated role. So the pay equity looks at gender, and that's an important piece. So you would only look externally if you had almost no male jobs in your organization. And then it's prescribed in the Act as to which organizations you go and look at as comparators. But ordinarily, you would be looking at just internally at relative rates of pay within your organization. And so lots of the arguments against pay equity initially were that we're all happy. We're all happy with just the way things are. Thank you. So we don't think that these jobs that women fill should be paid as much as the jobs that men fulfill. And so pay equity upsets that apple cart and says we should look at job values and we should make comparisons and pay on that basis, not because it's something that females have done historically. We have to value the work based on the work. So if you want a history lesson on pay equity, the studies that were done in the States found that this is the example that gets used all the time, is that the pay for dog catchers in most states was higher than the pay for daycare workers. So go figure that people who take care of our children are paid less than people who take care of our pets. That doesn't sit well with most people, at least not with most women anyway. But I think men were quite happy with it because they were dog catchers, and most of the daycare workers were women. So pay equity's disrupted a lot of that. And when I talk to young women today, I have to tell you that a lot of them don't get it. They say, "Why are we talking about gender? Like, really, it's not a big deal." But it was historically, still is in some cases. So pay equity is an important piece in bringing equity into your organization, but you have to consider it from an efficiency perspective always, because you don't have unlimited money to pay people. But you need to look at how fair you can be in paying jobs comparably. And the basis for that is job evaluation. So when we talk about fairness, what a word. Fairness is in the eye of the beholder, something like that. So the thing about pay satisfaction and employees is that usually people are happy to get more pay. That makes them feel like it's fair. But it isn't the only criteria that employees use. And often employees look at outside organizations. They look out and say, I have a friend who works over there, and she works in pretty well the same job as me, and she's get paid $5 more an hour than me, or $2 an hour, or whatever. We're all capable of doing that. We can all look at other jobs. We can all cherry pick and find a job somewhere that's pretty similar to ours, but that pays better. And employees are pretty good at doing that and pointing that out to their human resources people and their managers. So they look inside as well and look at, how is it that Henry got a raise and I didn't, or those kinds of things. I mean, employees are bound to do that. It's it's just part of being human, I think. So the stipulation in under pay equity is, again, you look internally at relative pay and job values within your organization, and you only look outside if you're doing a proxy comparison, which is restrictive in terms of trying to be fair. But the important piece about fairness is that there's been a great deal of research looking at how people view fairness. And consistently, what it shows is that attention to procedural and distributive justice principles is very important. Being able to explain to someone how a policy is applied, that this is the policy and this is how we made the decision, makes it much more acceptable to look at the outcomes. So you can say to me, the reason you didn't get a pay raise was because of these factors in our policy. Or the reason your pay raise was smaller than Henry's was because of these things in our policy. It's easier for me to accept the results if you can explain to me how you got there, how the decision was made. So transparency is really important in fairness. And people will not always like the results, but they will accept them more easily if you can explain how you made the decision, and you can show that the decision is made from a policy as opposed to a one-off. Because then you end up with inconsistencies and that leads down to other problems. So in terms of compliance, those of you who work in HR will have, seen all you deal with minimum wages and overtime and all kinds of statutory things on a regular basis. But pay equity is critically important because especially in Ontario, because it's complaint-based. So, and there is no limit on when an employee can file a complaint. So someone who worked for you 20 years ago could file a complaint tomorrow. Someone who works for you now could file a complaint. And if they file a complaint, this is no different than a Ministry of Labor officer or a health and safety inspector. It's the same kind of thing. If they file a complaint, then the ministry responsible has to come and do an investigation. If it seems like the complaint has validity of any kind. The difference with pay equity is that the legislation required that employers implement pay equity in 1990 in Ontario, unless they were doing proxy, and that's 1994. If you did not do anything in your organization, like you've never done a pay equity study, you haven't put a plan in place, you haven't got any kind of a study that proves that you have pay equity, you can be forced to go back to 1990 in terms of retro pay. And I tell that to people because it's scary, because the potential liability is huge. And I've had clients that have had to pay like $250,000 because they didn't do pay equity when they were supposed to. Where you come up with that kind of money is hard to say. but it's not easy. And especially under the funding restrictions that everyone faces, it's a very scary proposition if you haven't ever done pay equity. So I think it's important for you to think about your organization and whether they've ever done a pay equity plan. Most Indigenous organizations that are friendship centers for sure, and I've worked with several of them, and they have been monitored. They got on the list with the Pay Equity Commission, and they monitored all the friendship centers in Ontario and caught some of them having not done pay equity or not maintained it. Women's crisis centers are covered by the legislation. Daycare services, I see I've got a typo there. Addiction services, community health services, they're all covered by the legislation. So you need to find out, if you haven't done anything, you need to find out if your organization is covered by the legislation in Ontario. And you can do that by going to the schedule, and I've included the URL for the schedule for the Pay Equity Act in my last slide. But you should, if you haven't looked, you should look it up and see whether you think you're covered. If you're not covered, that doesn't stop you from voluntarily doing something. There is now federal legislation, and so far, Indigenous organizations are not covered. I've had some clients who have voluntarily complied because they think it's going to come their way anyway, and they wanted to make it part of their internal equity program. So you should look at it and see whether or not you might be covered. I've given you the URL for a case. It's a friendship center in Kapuskasing, and if you work for a friendship center and you haven't seen this case, you should look at it. I'll just give you a quick summary. What happened was the employer didn't do pay equity when they were supposed to back in 1990. They got monitored and by the Pay Equity Commission, and they were told they should develop a pay equity plan. So they started work on it, didn't get too far. The employee who was working on it left the organization, and along with a couple of other employees, filed a complaint. So they got a review officer involved. An investigation was done. The review officer said, because of the situation you're in, because it's been since 1990 and you don't have all those records going back that far, you need to go back 7 years, because that's what the law says. You have to keep records for 7 years in your organization, and you'll have to go back 7 years. The employees weren't happy with that. So it was appealed. And what the tribunal, which heard the appeal, said essentially was, we're pretty sympathetic for employers who did a pay equity plan in 1990 and can demonstrate they did something. They have some kind of records. They have a job evaluation tool. They have some ratings that were done. They can't find their plan, maybe, but they can show us that they did something, and that they made an attempt at pay equity, and we believe them when they say they achieved it. And so, yes, and so anyway, they said we'll have no sympathy for an employer who didn't ever do pay equity. And it doesn't matter what you say about your records. You can go to Revenue Canada and you can find out who was employed in every year. You can find out what their annual pay was, and you can do a comparison. You can also look at other friendship centers and look at what their comparisons were, and you can work from that data. There are ways to make this happen, and we will not let you off the hook. That's essentially what they said. And so it's not just friendship centers. This ruling affects employers right across Ontario. And so what I've been saying to my clients is that, because I've got clients who never did pay equity or they can't prove it. And so I've said, get a plan in place, because at least it cuts the liability. They might still make you go back, but from that day forward, you don't have a liability anymore. And it shows that you at least made the attempt to have a plan. And you're working on it. And but really, I have many clients who did do some work on pay equity, but they don't have the records any longer. 1990 was a long time ago. People who did the work are long gone. They retired, they left, they've moved on. Nobody knows where the heck they are. So they couldn't even get them to give evidence at this point. I'm one of the few people that's still kicking around that did pay equity back in 1987. That's when I started in this, and I keep all my files, so I get calls 2 or 3 times a year from people saying, "Did you by any chance do our pay equity plan? Because we can't find any records, and we're hoping you have them." Um, but it's a scary thing to think that if you didn't do pay equity in your organization and you're covered, that you could get caught in a very, very financially risky situation. And so I really urge you, if you haven't looked at pay equity in your organization, look at it now and at least find out whether you've got a liability. So that's my spiel. I went a little longer than I thought I would. I apologize. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
Hi, Gail. Good to see you again. I guess one of the questions that I have is we have various positions. I'm working with an Indigenous organization, Northern Sami Education Council, where we have various positions of people that are teaching to people that are house parents taking care of our students. Um, some positions in our organization require travel, supervising of others. And so I'm just basically asking this question more or less for others to be aware that when we're doing this process here, that we take all of that into consideration of, um, let's say, time away from home or supervising or not supervising positions also. And I have to say that I'm thankful to have been able to be part of this session that you're doing now because it's something that we know in our Indigenous organizations to try and recruit more of our people to work with our people and for our people also. Miigwech, thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point, though. Your job evaluation tool, if you're using one, should take all those things into account because there are variations in terms of the working conditions that people have, their responsibilities, their skills, their effort. So all of those things have to be taken into account, or at least the critical pieces have to be measured to be fair.
How often should your compensation be reviewed then? Once you have this in place and you're done, is
You're
it
never
annual, like
done.
what process?
You're never done. The thing about job evaluation is that jobs change over time, so you have to keep up to date on those changes. Just because a job, here's where we get into trouble with job evaluation. So it used to be I did 7 reports a month, okay, and now I have 10 reports a month to do. Probably that's not going to change the job evaluation. It's the work has gone this way, but it hasn't gone this way. Job evaluation is really good at differentiating on the basis of the level of responsibilities or skills or whatever, but not on the size of the workload. And so people confuse workload changes with changes in skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. Clearly, if I used to type reports and now I write those reports, there's a difference in my responsibility and skills. So that would have to be taken into account. But either way, you need to stay on top of job changes. And when there are significant changes, the job has to be reevaluated in order to see whether or not it will change pay bands, if you're using pay bands, or perhaps have a move into a different pay range for some reason. But it never ends. It's like job security for HR people, really.
It's the maintenance of it, right? So anytime the position changes or you have a new position that's introduced to the workplace, that's when you would use the job evaluation tool, which I was hoping to see today. I was hoping to see
Ah,
I was hoping to see a job evaluation tool. It's been a long time since I've done pay equity. I don't know if you remember me, Gail, but
yes, I
at
do.
shelter. Yeah, so I was hoping to see a tool today just because and I'm glad I saw the slide about like who it's applicable to because we always get into this. I think you know, in my last few years of experience anyways, I've gotten into this murky water of jurisdiction with working with Indigenous organizations because the majority of the funding usually comes from ISK. However, when you are working in places like education or nursing, you know, it
Mm.
depends, um, I guess, which legislation. Even when I was working with my First Nation in the CFS department, you know, you think automatically that you're federally regulated. However, if you are getting ministry dollar, like there's a number of different determining factors that they look at when doing that jurisdiction review. So I just would be careful about automatically thinking that you're federally regulated because you're working for an Indigenous organization. The nursing is a good one because obviously they have standards that they have to follow. Education is another one. When you say A1, A2, A3, when they're following those types of things, there's certain standards that they have to follow within that profession. Social workers, if they're registered social workers, then they have to follow that, you know, association or professional standards, right? That they are applicable to. Those types of things matter when they're doing jurisdiction review. So it doesn't always mean that you're federally regulated if you're working for an Indigenous
Mm.
organization, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So we
No,
shouldn't think
that's
that
very good.
we're exempt from it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it really comes down to sometimes a legal analysis to figure out whether you're covered by one piece of legislation or the other. But you need to know. But I have clients that have where the situation has changed over time. So initially, back in 1990, they weren't covered by the provincial legislation because they got most of their funding from the federal government, and they worked under the Canada Labor Code and all that stuff. But over time, their funding has changed. And so now it's like 50-50. So they're going, well, I don't know, like, which way do we go here? Are we going to get, you know, the Pay Equity Commission coming along saying, oh, our ruling is that you must comply and you should have complied, you know, back in 1990. The argument I would make would be, well, it would only be from the date that we got the 50-50 funding. If we have to comply, then that would be more appropriate. But still, there are lots of legal issues associated with it. And it's not always as clear cut as you might think it is. But that schedule is pretty clear. It tells you which Indigenous organizations have to go find a proxy employer. And if you're on that list, then for sure your organization is covered. Otherwise, it's kind of one of our arguments was that initially was that the organization shouldn't be covered by Ontario's legislation. But anyway, we lost that argument, but won some others. But anyway, but you know, it's not a simple thing. Sometimes it's so straightforward, and sometimes it's very, very gray.
So I guess that's a no to the tool, eh?
Yeah, I'll tell you though, the Pay Equity Commission still makes tools available
Okay.
for free, so you can look at any of those.
Yeah, because you see the pay bands and you see the point system there, right?
Mhm.
And it's how do you get the point, like how do you allocate the points? And I remember that when we were evaluating the education responsibility skill, like the SEWR, right? The acronym, education responsibility skills and working conditions, we didn't allocate, it wasn't like 25% per criteria.
No.
Responsibility is usually given a little bit more, and then educate, like, you know, so it was quite complex, especially for, I don't know about all you other HR professionals out there, but for me, if you're an HR professional, you don't like numbers. It's not your jam, or you would have been an accountant. So numbers for me, when we get there, it's a little hokey pokey for me, and it doesn't always make sense. I need some help.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I didn't bring a job evaluation tool with me today. That would be for another session. But there are some freebies out there that you can use. And I would just be cautious if I have clients who have job evaluation tools that they got from somebody else. And, you know, who kindly gave it to them and who got it from somebody else, who got it from somebody else, who got it from somebody else. Anyway, the thing is, they ended up with a tool that really wasn't very appropriate for their organization because it didn't measure some of the main components in their organization. Or there are tools out there that are very much for management jobs, but not for operations level jobs, for example. And so they just don't, I mean, you can make them work, but it's a lot of work to make them work if they're not actually intended for the kind of organization you have. The ones that the Pay Equity Commission has published in Ontario are pretty generic and they're pretty editable. You can make them work for you. You can take factors out, change the factors. They're pretty good. And the guidebooks that they published now 20 some years ago or 30 years ago are very detailed. I'm pretty sure they're still available on their website.
And they probably wouldn't include all the traditional and cultural
No,
components
they
that we
don't.
discussed today, which is why you
No.
got to hire Gail.
Well, you don't have to hire Gail necessarily, but you could do it yourself. But it takes time
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, but I think well worth it because I just think more and more Indigenous organizations are saying enough of this stuff. Like I can't be fair to the jobs and the people that I'm trying to hire and attract. So because honestly, I've had an organization where they had a job that required traditional knowledge and they had it rated at less than high school because in the conventional scale, they didn't have any place else to put it. There wasn't anything in the scale that valued the traditional knowledge that they needed. And so the person they hired actually had less than high school because that's not what they needed. They didn't need someone with a formal education. They needed somebody with that traditional knowledge, but it really undervalued the work. And so sometimes what happens is when you add traditional knowledge, then all of a sudden, holy cow, this job that used to pay $20,000 a year, now it's like 50 or 60. And now you have to come up with the money to pay them properly as well. But I think that's a worthwhile endeavor. If you're going to find people who can fulfill the roles that you have, and do them very well, and they have a quality background, then maybe you try to find that money and pay them properly. Someone's got a hand up.
Okay, so I put my hand up. A few years back, I developed a job analysis form for staff to complete. And within that form, it kind of highlights and identifies, what are the areas of knowledge you need to have for the position? What is the experience you need to have for the position? And you can input your own lines there. So it's like knowledge skill, right? And you put your own lines and you say whether it's critical, whether it's something that can be provided on the job, whether it's something that's not really needed. And we kind of did this based off of our job descriptions. I don't know for everyone else, but some of our job descriptions were quite old when I first came on, starting 1992. I see you, Betsy, laughing already. And so I wanted to really go through it and identify like where were the gaps? Because if I was to take that job post from 1992 and put it out there, the role has changed so much, so much. That person who was originally hired to take calls and check the mail and do this now does weekly kitchen cleanup and the kitchen fridge cleanup and all those things. And I really wanted to see where all of my staff were sitting when it came down to like, okay, these are the jobs that are listed in your duties, but what else do you do? What do you, and some of these are things that they've just taken on over the years. Like I know we have some people here who've been working for us for over 30 years. For over 30 years. And a lot of what they do is not sitting on that job duty. It's not on that job description. If I was to replace them, we'd learn real fast all that extra quiet labor that they do in the background. So for those who really want to see and identify how to gauge this pay equity, and that includes your knowledge too, right? The knowledge
Yes.
holders. What is critical? Are you just looking for someone to bring forward some teachings? So they need to have some teachings to pass on the knowledge, or do they need to actually perform ceremony? Do they need to do the preparation for ceremony? All of that quiet work that a lot of people don't see. do one of these job analysis. And I mean, if you got access to HR files, I'm pretty sure you guys could give us all a great job analysis one. Mine was pulled from the course I was taking on from Human Resources. So I took some of the questions that they took in there, and then I added a few of my own just to make sure it works for us. But I think that's a great way to start to build something for this pay equity, because you can sit there and, like you said, you can look across the street and say they do the same thing as me, but they're getting paid more. But when you really dig deep into the actual duties that are assigned, somebody across the street could have 5 people that they supervise and you have 1, right? So we need to look at it that way as well. It's not just about the duties, but the level of oversight, the level of management, the level of expertise that you apply to each of those duties. You could have someone that does minute taking, right? And minute taking is pretty basic. It's pretty basic. But what if that minute taker also puts everything up on the website and checks daily that the information's out there for the members and does the agenda and all that? So you could have a minute taker, but you could have someone that does minutes and over and above. And I think those job analysis tools are great for this type of conversation.
Yeah, I would totally agree. That's your starting point before you evaluate jobs, is to make sure that you have consistently developed and accurate and current information for all of the jobs equally. So you can't really do a fair job if some of the job information is from 30 years ago and some of it is from last week. It has to be up to date. One of the difficulties in HR, I think, today is that most of you have too little time and too many duties to kind of be working on job descriptions all the time. So some organizations have involved managers in writing job descriptions rather than keeping that as part of an HR portfolio. I'm of two minds. Sometimes they become very inconsistent. Some managers will write a job description that's 8 pages long and very detailed, and others will write you a 1-page job description that's very skimpy. And so if you're going to go that route and have other people write job descriptions, it's very important that you have some sort of template, that organizes the information and ensures that you get all the information. So if you're going to do it that way, I would go back to my job evaluation tool and say, okay, these are the sub-factors that we're measuring in the tool. I want a section in each job description that speaks to each of those sections. So if you use a job analysis tool to collect the information in the first place, then the data comes from that part of the job analysis tool and gets written up in a more formalized way in your job description. It doesn't have to be fancy, but it has to be complete.
I would like to share that for us, what we're doing is when the performance evaluations are taking place, and I'm not saying that they've been consistent throughout the years, but as we're kind of honing in and cleaning things up and getting better at what we're doing, what we've been asking from the HR point is that when performance evaluations are done, that the employee and the supervisor take a look at the job description and update it during that time. And then it's also placed with the evaluation and signed by the employee and the supervisor to recognize that the duties have changed. This way here, if somebody actually leaves, you know what that position is required to do when you're looking for somebody to fill that position. The other thing I would like to say is if for some reason your organization, your First Nation community has not been able to update your pay scales for whatever reasons, an easy-ish way of recognizing the ability to speak the language or be able to read the language in syllabics is by placing an incentive, native language incentive in the policies, which have to be approved by the board of directors. But that way there you're recognizing and acknowledging not just the language, but the culture that comes with the language. So I want to say thank you, Miigwech.
Thanks. Best practice is to keep the job descriptions updated and to involve employees in updating them. And the two people closest to the job are always the person who does the job and the person who supervises the job. So making that part of your annual performance appraisal is an excellent way to update the job description, get agreement between the two of them, and recognize also, because sometimes things slip through the cracks. Something got delegated to the employee, 8 months ago, that we thought would be temporary, and 8 months have gone by, and now they're doing it all the time, and so it should be included in the job description, and so it's a really great way to make things to keep them current, or as current as you can. You can't be doing it every week, but even once a year is not a bad policy. So thank you so much. And thanks to GovernWise for inviting me today. And thanks for taking the time out to participate. And thanks for sharing all these ideas and experiences that people have. This is great. It's been a good hour for me. And I hope it was for you too.